Hi, hope everybody's doing well. Thank you so much for taking time to join us. For those of you I haven't met, my name is John Gomez. I'm the Chief Security and Engineering Officer here at CloudWave. And in this session, we're going to start talking about a new approach to incident response. And I say start because this is a really, really big topic. It's something we're going to also continue to speak about in many of our upcoming Cybersecurity Insider Program events and webinars. Specifically, we'll be addressing it next month when we host a very special guest, which will be the FDA. And apparently, when we did some of the planning with FDA, they have a lot to say about incident response. So we'll talk more about that and kind of how you can participate in that event next month. But with that, I want to kind of get started and start helping lay some of the foundation related to kind of what we think is a monumental shift in how incident response should be handled when it comes to cybersecurity in healthcare specifically. Some of you that have been associated with us, partnered with us, and work with us probably already know this, but I think it bears worth repeating. As a cybersecurity organization, as CloudWave, I'd like to believe that we're not the status quo. I think the job of any technology vendor, especially one that's involved in hosting and recovery and restoration and cybersecurity, should be coloring outside the lines. We should be trying to figure out why what we're doing collectively is not working and how we can kind of bend the rules, change the rules to get things to work. And we've spent a lot of time over the past 5 years or so really trying to think about how do we change the focus on incident response? And the question you all may have is, well, why do we need to change the focus? Like, isn't what we're doing okay? And I would argue, in the spirit of trying to be a bit rebellious and different and really kind of continuous improvement, that no, our traditional incident response methods to healthcare, specifically when it comes to cyber attacks, has been a big failure. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. What we're going to present to you today is really kind of the outcome of that realization. Now, for some of you, you may be saying, well, we knew this all along, which is great because you're kind of ahead of the curve. But I think the hard part was trying to understand, you know, are we just kind of preaching to the choir and everybody already knows this and, not sure what to do about it? Or is it just so obvious and we're kind of the ones that find this kind of magical and mystical that there needs to be a different focus on incident response? Now, what do I mean by traditional incident response? Traditional incident response would be, for me, what we've been teaching since the early 2000s when it comes to how to develop an IR plan. How do you develop a DR plan? How do you develop your recovery testing or your integrity testing? Like, how do you do these things? And I think a lot of that serves other industries really well, right? So if we were all working at, Walmart, or we were all working in a bank, I think those approaches are fundamentally strong and appropriate. But when we move from those industries to healthcare, and ultimately we have human lives that are on the line, I think everything we've learned, whether it's about cybersecurity or disaster recovery, are not appropriate, right? We can't take what we do at Walmart or whatever bank you want to talk about or whoever it may be and apply that to healthcare. And to be quite honest, when I first got involved in healthcare, which is now probably about 2 decades ago, I kind of, people would tell me healthcare is different, you don't get it, it's more complex. And I would think, well, yeah, I'm sure it is, but everybody says that when you enter into an industry. And I guess now looking back on it 20 years later, I finally have drank that Kool-Aid that it is vastly different. And I think the thing that makes it different is not the complexity of systems or the amount of systems, right? I think those things need to be respected. I think ultimately what truly sets it apart is the most fundamental piece of healthcare, which is we are all responsible for the care and safety of humans, right? Patients. And I think when we add that into the mix, suddenly everything we think about is vastly different. And I think that's been the missing component in how we address incident response for cybersecurity as well as disaster recovery in general. I would argue, and I'm not going to get that into this in this presentation, but things like RTO and RPO and all the things we think about with traditional disaster recovery do not apply in healthcare. And mostly because we think about all this from a systems technology perspective and not the human patient perspective. So, I'll touch on some of this as far as incident response goes, but possibly some point in the future, we need to do a deep dive, if you think is worth your time, on disaster recovery specifically in healthcare that is patient centric. But with that, I want to get into kind of the meat and potatoes and of what we're talking about today. And my hope in this presentation is that you start to rethink incident response. And even if that rethinking takes you back to exactly where you are right now and you throw out anything I say, I think it's still a good exercise to evaluate if the approaches that you're using for incident response are appropriate and are patient-centric. And you may find that they are, and that's awesome. And you truly are, at least from our perspective and our experience, probably in the 1% if you're doing patient-centric incident response. So with that, let's kind of jump into this a little bit deeper and give you some ideas of not only what we were talking about, but how we got here. Now, I've mentioned this in other presentations, but I think it's worth repeating in that why should you listen to us on this topic? What do we bring to the table that everybody else hasn't, and why isn't anybody else talking about this and you guys are? I think part of it is we have invested a ton of time in terms of incident response, and a lot of that's been done in terms of our not only doing tabletops but also doing actual true incident response where somebody has called us or we've detected a threat and we've responded to it as part of our security operations center and had to deal with the consequences of that. Now, there's a typo on this slide. We haven't had 12,000 people go through our tabletops. We've had more like 1,200 people go through our tabletops. And over the past 2 years, what I've seen is a shift in tabletops. I don't think the technical tabletop will ever go away, and I think there's value to doing a technical tabletop. And by technical tabletop, I mean those tabletops that focus on IT, right? Where we bring IT teams in and we go through some level of tabletop. But I will be honest that I think that the value of those is very small. And there could be debate to that, and I'm sure there's regulators and others in the academic world that would debate me on that. But the reason I say that the value of that is small is because later on I'm going to basically tell you there's only one of two things that IT can do in any real cyber attack. And so we'll get to that later. But the other thing I've realized is that when we go through tabletops with IT, generally for the most part, the IT organization knows what to do. There's not really any great learning, no tipping point that we find over the past 2 years when we're working just with IT doing a tabletop. What we do find is there's tremendous value when we step outside of IT and take the exact same tabletop when we replicate or simulate a cyber attack and do that with non-IT personnel within the hospital. Right, as soon as we get the clinicians and the operational staff and the financial staff and the security teams and senior leadership and executive leadership and put them in the middle of a cyber event, we find that there's tremendous things that we learn and amazing things that we learn and a vast amount of opportunity for improvement. Now, if we think about that, this is just simply replicating a real world attack. The sad part of this is if we don't put people through that type of this exercise, the only time that they actually get to test those skill sets is in a real attack. And this may explain why real attacks are so devastating beyond just the IT component of it. So I think this is part of where we started to realize, like, we need to change how we do incident response, because our tabletops are telling us that, hey, for the most part, IT knows what to do. So we've had tremendous kind of success in that space, and for the past 2 years, we've been really good at doing this non-IT tabletop capability. But we've also responded to real-world incidents. And what's interesting is when we get called in to do an actual incident response, usually it's very early in the process. The questions that we ask kind of create deer in the headline moments for people, because I think that what most people are asking of us is to help them with responding to the attack, and what we're more concerned about is what's happening with the patient environment. And that's usually something that takes people a little bit aback, because again, typically if you're going to call us, you're probably in IT, and the last thing you expect from us is to start asking you clinical questions. But the reality is that from the very beginning, we've always thought that patients have to come first. And now, unfortunately, I think we're being proved right in that. And I mean that, unfortunately, truly and sincerely, because that's probably not an area we wanted to be right. We ultimately always wanted to be right that, hey, protect the data and we're good to go. So there are a lot of observations we've seen when it comes to incident response, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. One is that most incident response programs typically protect data. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Typically within 15 minutes of a high velocity attack, we see that things start to break down. Right, when an attack occurs, and we're talking about really serious, fast-moving attacks, we see that all the reliance on plans in terms of incident response plans and disaster recovery plans break down. We see this in tabletops, and we see this in actual real incident response situations. And some people have asked me, well, then why should I have an incident response plan, like an actual written plan? And the only reason I can give you is in the traditional sense is because you're going to be asked about it when you go through a security assessment or an audit of some nature related to HIPAA or some other framework like NIST or HITRUST. But short of that, I've yet to see anybody pull out their incident response plan and actually be able to work through it. And it actually works for them. It just, things fall apart very quickly. And that's because muscle memory is not used, right? We focus more time and energy on writing the plan because we know auditors are going to ask for it than actually training our teams to create muscle memory that they can just respond without having to dig out a plan, right? And a checklist and whatever else we may need to respond to a DDoS attack or whatever it may be. And that's part of the first steps in the breakdown of incident response. And this will have consequences later when we talk about patient-centric incident response. Right now, we're really talking about observations of traditional incident response. There's also very little respect for or understanding of emotional and psychological aspects of the responder, of the people responding. And again, we're going to talk more about that in a moment, but I can tell you that if your plan does not have anything in it related to emotion and psychology, your plan will fail. And I know that's a very bold claim, and I'm not trying to be cocky, but I will explain why in a little bit down the road, that the most important thing you can do in any plan, aside from trying to gain muscle memory, is assure you're managing the emotional and psychological response to an attack. And if you're not doing that, there will be very, very negative outcomes that occur. Most programs don't recognize or appreciate the skills of the attacker. I can speak about this all day, but we have a term here, kind of two terms that we talk to within our organization, and that kind of become, our pulpit of sorts, is we need to always understand the attacker's perspective, and we need to understand the attacker's audacity. Now, perspective is their psychology and their motivation and passion. So the soft skill stuff, and their audacity is really more about their ability to do whatever they need to do because of their skills. So again, we talk a lot more about that, but I think plans don't really think through that part of the equation. Most programs are extremely hierarchical. And this again is a big problem. I think this is just because of the way IT works, right? Like most things in healthcare IT, if not all IT across industries, is very hierarchical, right? You have to get permission from somebody to do something, and they have to get permission from someone, and then you have to get buy-in from the business units, and everybody's got to come together and understand the risks and the consequences and the outcomes. And unfortunately, when we're talking about cybersecurity incidents and attacks, none of that matters to the attacker. The attacker is not going to sit by and wait for you guys to have a bunch of meetings to figure out if you should shut down your EMR or not, or should you air gap the system, or should you take network infrastructure offline, or should you allow for automated failovers. None of that is going to be discussed by the attacker with you, right? They don't really care about your hierarchical process. Now, what's really interesting, and kind of playing forward a little bit about where incident response needs to go, is that the only place we see hierarchy on this level is within IT, and maybe some of the non-clinical areas of the hospital, possibly like finance. But for most of the clinical processes in a hospital, in terms of what nurses, doctors, therapists, and all of that team does, there is very little hierarchy. In fact, the best functioning, highest functioning clinical teams have very little hierarchy. And I can give you practical examples of that, but in the interest of time, I'll hold off on that. But that's interesting to me in terms of, wow, for IT, we have all this hierarchy, yet when it comes to taking care of human life and somebody having a heart attack or bleeding out, the hierarchy is not applied when we're dealing with things that are extremely critical, such as human life. So I think we need to take a lesson from clinicians on how does that work? And I'll talk more about that in a moment. Bottom line is, the easiest way to think about this is, in order to have effective incident response in terms of cybersecurity and the associated recovery and backup, we have to fix each one of these things. If we don't fix these things, then no matter what we do, we won't have an effective incident response program. Now, what I want to talk about and give us some context is how quickly attacks occur, right? What I call the attack violence and velocity. And attack violence is simply, on a scale of 1 to 5, how violent is this attack, right? Are we simply in a situation where we can reboot a system and we'll be back online? Or has the attacker really destroyed the ability to do that? Meaning that if you reboot or if you try to use this equipment, it is completely destroyed. By completely destroyed, I mean you can't reboot, you can't reinstall the operating system, you can't reinstall applications. You literally have to take this machine and throw it in a dumpster. And so that's kind of the level of violence that we're talking about. And yes, we have seen that occur. Those types of attack, a level 5 violent attack has occurred multiple times throughout healthcare. And so it's important to understand that the violence of the attack is very important for us to understand. And when we think about things like disaster recovery, I'm pretty sure nobody is talking about things like attack violence in terms of how that impacts our recovery capabilities. But it is something we have to think about. And then velocity is rather simple. It's how fast is this attack moving across our environment, and how do we deal with that? So those two components are vital. And if we're not starting from attack violence and velocity, then we miss things like attacker perspective and audacity, and all the other components really are kind of not based in a reality of what type of attacks we need to deal with. So what you see here on the screen, I'll let this play out, is basically a ransomware attack. There are two different computers being used here. You'll see the attack start here and then spread here. And the reason I do this is because I'm finding even within IT, there are very few people that have actually seen an actual ransomware attack unfold. So I think part of our responsibility should be that if we're going to defend about or talk about ransomware attacks, we should at least see one. So I'll let this play. It's about a minute and a half or so, and it'll pop up little pop-ups as it goes through to explain what you're seeing. So again, the reason I bring this up is because of the velocity of this attack. Now, we don't understand the violence of this attack because we can't really, in this context, understand, is this just, hey, pay the ransom and you get your system back, or is there something more nefarious going on here? I mean, if you look at it, the attacker in this is stating that if you don't pay in a certain period of time, they're going to start destroying files. So that would be considered probably a level 2, level 3 violence, right? And so we're seeing violence, and that's a very purposeful word. I think we can't keep kind of dancing around the fact that what's happening when it comes to attacks is just this like, oh, soft kind of, reality. Like there is a violent component to any cyber attack, especially against a hospital. And that violence actually will become more important to us as we continue down the path of discussing this. So about 2 minutes, we have 2 computers impacted. Challenge here is that those 2 computers will now reach out to another 2. So we'll have 4, then we're going to go to 8, 16, and obviously, evolve from there. So the velocity is going to play a big role in how do we respond, right? What do we do as IT? So if there's anything to take away from this in terms of an IT tabletop and your incident response plan is, does your incident response plan talk to or think about or factor in violence and velocity. I've audited some really great incident response plans, and in terms of the academics of evaluating an incident response plan, they're spot on. But the moment I start asking about violence and velocity, the plans fall apart. And again, we've seen this in real world incidents that we've responded to. We've done the after action reports on for ones we haven't responded to, and also the outcome of our tabletops. So we know that when you introduce violence and velocity, that increases stress, the plans fall apart, and now bad decision making ensues, which is obviously not what we want. So another way to think about this is 197, right? Now this number changes. I think we're actually at 203 or something like that this past year. So this number may be a little dated. It's unfortunate because this is not a good number. What this number is, if you're not familiar with it, is that every year for several years, probably about a decade or more, there's been a report that comes out that tries to quantify how long an attacker has been in somebody's network on average across all industries before they're detected. And the average is somewhere typically in the area of 200 days. So I think this is like 2 years old. This is about 197 days. And like I said, I think last year, 2023, we were in 203 or 207 days. And it fluctuates up and down. Like a great year was, I think 7 years ago, we were at 186 and we could have all celebrated. The problem with this number is a variety of different things. One, most of the tools that we rely on across all vendors aren't doing a good job of finding people in our network. Two is the reality that the attacker has spent a ton of time in our network, understanding everything there is to understand about our end of life systems, our patch levels, our network topology, where our backups are. They've probably polluted or caused integrity issues to our backups, a variety of different things that have occurred, which they are able to do because they're gathering intelligence in a covert manner. Now, honestly, the quickest way to detect this is typically honeypots, right? Because if they bump into a honeypot, the gig is up. You can't be covert anymore. But that aside, I think the issue here is it changes the threat vector, right? If somebody has about 200 days of intelligence on your environment and everything that is related to your environment, where your systems are and everything I mentioned, that allows them to craft a very serious attack because they know where to go and how to take things out as fast as possible. And this has been a shift that we've seen again over the last 2 years in terms of how ransomware works. Originally, it was, hey, click or open something and the attack immediately ensues, kind of like what you saw in that video. Today, what we see is click, open, or some other vectors used to gain access to the network, and the attackers don't launch an attack. They just stay in the environment and do reconnaissance. And then when they're ready and they have all their ducks in a row and they've tested everything, they launch the attack then. And it's a very, very specific targeted attack. So I think we need to be aware of this because our chances of actually repelling the attack are dramatically lower than we may think, even if we have tools that are going to quarantine things and do stuff like that. But in any case, I can talk more about this if you wish at some point, but I just want to give you some context on the speed and the reconnaissance capabilities. I'm not going to go too deep into the nuance attack because I want to get into the meat of our presentation, but if you're not familiar with the nuance attack, happened several years ago, but still I think there's a lot to learn from us. This is an attack that did employ high violence, a level 5 of violence, and was extremely fast. What's interesting is the attack took place in about 14 minutes across all of Nuance's worldwide computer network. And we now know today that that was a NotPetya attack. But the reason I bring that up is it was the first time we were able to understand how fast an attack moves. And we came up with this concept, we being Cloudwave Sensato, about velocity and violence. It was really the foundation that was created, was Nuance created that foundation of thinking in terms of violence and velocity. And we found that that attack took place about 14 minutes. And that leads to this thing known as the critical success target that we created, right? And the critical success target basically says that most attacks we've seen, most attacks we've responded to that are very high violence, high velocity, or have one of two of those elements at the higher end of the scale, typically will be completed within about 14 minutes, right? So you basically have within 14 minutes, you have to, as IT, figure out, how you're going to shut this attack down, actions you're going to take. So again, going back to the response plan, to think about when we think about velocity, right? We said velocity has to be a component of the plan. You really need to think about can you respond, identify, detect and respond within 14 minutes or less, right? If not, you're immediately in recovery mode. And that's just the reality. Now, some of you may say, well, there's no way we could do that and might as well give up the ship. That's not really what we're saying here. We're trying to just be realistic about this is probably the reality that you're going to face, which means that you need to really think about recovery. Now, the way we work with organizations on this is not everybody can afford to respond in 14 minutes or less. The resource requirements are pretty high. But what you could do is start getting better at your response times than wherever you are now, right? So if you can't do 14 minutes, could you, detect and respond within 60 minutes? And if you can, then what can we do? What can we tweak to get to 50 minutes or 45? And you may never get to 14, but one of the things we've done is optimized our response. What is important to understand is we have to have some standard, some level, some target that we can measure against. And basically everything we've seen since the Nuance attack has been typically that a attack that is highly violent or of a high velocity will complete within 14 minutes from the time the attack is launched. And I think that's important to understand. It's not from the time you find out about the attack, it's from the time the attack is launched. So early detection is critical. Obviously, detecting the attackers before the attack is ever launched is even more critical, and getting harder to do with time. So the other thing I want to bring up here is this concept of data-centric viewpoint. And I mentioned this earlier that most incident response plans are focused on data and protecting data. In fact, I would go further than that and say probably every cybersecurity strategy I've ever encountered in healthcare since I started Sensado back in 2013 that I've come across has been all about protecting the data. And the backdrop to that has been HIPAA, right? Like, well, we got to encrypt it because of HIPAA. We got to do this because of HIPAA. We have to have strong passwords because of HIPAA, right? Or whatever, whatever you're doing typically maps back to HIPAA. In fact, in some organizations, it's how we justify investment, right? Well, we got to do this, or we got to put this in place because if not, we won't pass our HIPAA assessment. Now, that's a really sad, unfortunate state of affairs. And it just really is. Like, we've completely failed at being guardians of healthcare from an IT perspective. And I'll include myself in that because I kind of drank that Kool-Aid in the early days as well. And over time, I've been kind of scratching my head thinking like, wait a minute, something's wrong here. The emperor has no clothes. And really the reality of this is that what we should have been doing all along is thinking about how do we protect the patient, right? How do we create technical solutions that ultimately are providing protection to our patients that do not allow anything to interrupt care. And that's what really the challenge is here. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't protect data and that data privacy is not important, but ultimately, if you raise the bar and say the number one thing that you as IT have to do is protect the ability to care for patients, right? And I've used this exact line of questioning, just so everybody knows, when I do board presentations. And if you don't know, we do, or C-suite presentations, right? Whenever we do C-suite or board presentations, which by the way, we don't charge for, you can just contact CloudWave, your salesperson, account person, whoever you want, say, hey, I need John to come in and do a board presentation or C-suite presentation, and I'm happy to do them. All right, and there's no selling or marketing. It's just, I think it's part of giving back and what we should be doing, right? Kind of walking the walk kind of thing. But whenever I brought up to any C-suite or board that you have one choice, your IT team can either protect the data or protect the patients during a cyber attack, which one would you like them to do? I have yet to have anybody say to me, protect the data. But yet all of our regulation, all of our practices, all of our technology, everything we talk about, our vendor evaluations, everything we do is about protecting data. What's really interesting is if you protect the patient, you will automatically protect the data. But we don't raise ourselves to that standard. We don't hold ourselves to that standard of we should be protecting patients. And that's going to fundamentally change. I can guarantee you in the next 2 to 3 years, I think regulations will change. And I can get into that later as to why, but it's going to be a dramatic change, I think, for our industry. So everything, there is no framework, no regulations, nothing that really drives this thinking of protect patients. But I don't think we all kind of are comfortable with that. I think many of us would be concerned of having our own family members on healthcare networks, knowing kind of the state of affairs across the industry, and that the focus is on protecting data, not patients. So I want to introduce another stat to you. This is 6 to 8. Now this stat is basically the amount of time that most organizations plan for when it comes to downtime. right? That if you're going to take downtime, probably sort of should be able to survive on paper for about 6 to 8 hours. Now, your documentation and your plans may say 16 hours or some greater number, but I haven't met anybody that has actually said, okay, if our documentation says 16 hours or 24 hours or 48 hours, we're going to test that and go down for 48 hours with no access to any system. And the other thing to understand about downtime, when it comes to downtime reporting and downtime of systems, is it normally is planned, right? You're going to do a major upgrade, so you're going to notify all the physicians or clinicians that, hey, we're going to be doing downtime, and they're going to tell you, okay, well, can you do it on this shift because we'll have a lot less people and it'll be a lot less, the census will be lower, and we don't have ambulatory and same day surgery, and you're not going to interrupt any of that. So you're going to pick an opportune moment to do your downtime. And unfortunately, none of that creates reality. It's a false sense of security. And when we go through and think about incident response and recovery, and people say to me like, oh, guess what? We do downtime procedure testing. What you're talking about is typically this. And if you're not, again, you're at that 1%, and you really should be proud of yourself, because very few people are going, you know what, we're going to just inadvertently pull the plug, shut down the systems, and see what the clinicians do. And that is real testing. And by the way, we're going to keep the systems offline for 24 hours, right? That's real testing. That's real feedback in terms of what's going to happen and how well you'll fare. The problem is this sets up a very serious false sense of security that ultimately translates to patient safety issues in a very real way. This is not reflective. And I would urge you that if you're speaking to your CI or your C-suite or your board, if you're having presenting to them and they're like, well, we test downtime, you should set them up for the reality that, well, yes, we do, but you should never ever think that the hospital will be able to respond to an attack with a real serious downtime, because we don't really know what will happen unless you've actually tested in some way, shape, or form. So all of this I've just talked about brings us to this Vanderbilt study, and the crux and the kind of tipping point where we've said you got to start doing patient-centric incident response. What we have learned, or what a Vanderbilt study learned, which by the way was done in 2016 and looked at cyber attacks over a 4-year period and on hospitals, and what they found in that research was that any significant cyber attack will lead to an increase in patient mortality. So to be, kind of direct about it, significant cyber attacks lead to people dying. That's basically it. That's the summary of the study. And again, and we can't go deep into it because of interest of time, but happy to discuss it further if you guys wish. The reason I bring this up is we need to define what is significant. Significant is any attack that interrupts or impacts hospital operations. And it doesn't have to be like the entire network going down, or it doesn't matter about how widespread the attack is. All that matters is that people in the organization become aware of the attack. And this ties all the way back to something I talked earlier, which is if your incident response plan does not factor in psychology and emotion, you will fail, at least from the perspective of being able to protect patients. If all you care about is protecting data, you'll probably be okay. So, which means you're probably in the wrong industry, because we should all be worried about how patient safety factors into everything we do. And the reality of this is that the psychology of the people on the ground is what ultimately kills patients. And the reason for that is because we don't factor in emotional and psychological response into our incident planning. So what do we mean by that? What we mean by that, again, this is a broader kind of set of conversations, but is as soon as people become aware of an attack, a cyber attack, right? Let's just use a ransomware attack because it's kind of the easiest one to do. And you see these messages popping up on the screens. The conversations on the floor, in the care units, in finance, in HR, in the kitchens, in the cafeteria, are all about the attack. Well, what did they get to? I heard they got to the payroll system. Are we getting paid? I don't know if we're getting paid. That's a great question. Well, if they got to the payroll system, did they get to our social security numbers? Do they know where we live? Do they have our W-2 forms? I don't know. Well, did they get to the medical devices? That's a great question. Can we even trust what we're seeing on the screens? How long are the systems going to be down? Everything I've just talked about is the dialogue that occurs on the ground when a cyber attack occurs. And that does one thing. It takes the focus off of caring for the patient. And in those moments, we see a decline in patient care. And when that decline occurs, sometimes it's irreversible. And when that occurs, we have increased mortality. And the reality of this is that most of us don't really think about incident response from this perspective. Yet, kind of the first tenet of healthcare is do no harm. Unfortunately, the plans that we've put together and the approaches that we take over the last 15 to 20 years have done a lot of harm. People have died, not because an attack has directly targeted patients. It's because our own actions have not safeguarded patients from the response. And this is why I kind of earlier on said that tabletops don't really need to be focused on IT. We need to focus on the rest of the organization. We need the rest of the organization to understand that you play a very significant role in protecting patients and in the response to a security incident. And the Vanderbilt study is kind of the backdrop or the foundation, the cornerstone of that thinking. And it's something that we've been really harping on for a very long time now. We're trying to make inroads in turn to get a bigger voice and in everybody understanding the criticality of this. So yes, the patient should be our focus. Everything that happens from a cyber incident response perspective should all be about the patient, including recovery. And we can talk about, again, disaster recovery plans must be patient-centric. And I'll touch on that a little bit. So some cardinal truths: cyber attacks do impact patient care, even if the attacker is not targeting patients, and they do move rather quickly, right? So we have this concept of violence and velocity. So I want to now switch into the framework, the basic tenets of patient-centric incident response. So I'm going to skip over this, where we got this from. Once we started realizing this, we actually started studying what works well when we have chaotic, massive incidents that need to be dealt with, and address all of the things we said earlier on in this presentation that are not hierarchical, that focus on muscle memory, that address psychology and emotion, and all of those other things. One area we found a lot of learning was in trauma centers and how they approach their protocols and execute their tasks. And we also found that special operations teams, SWAT teams, Navy SEALs, Green Berets, how they respond to chaotic situations has a lot that we can learn from. So we borrowed a lot from those worlds and embedded it into how we teach and how we evaluate and train people on incident response. We're not going to go into all of that today because obviously we don't have much time left, but if you just determine that, hey, you want to work with us and take on some of this and take the next steps in this area, these are things that we will definitely touch upon. So what we've found is that there's 4 things you need to be thinking about with your incident response plan. And again, this all bleeds into disaster recovery. So first thing is, and it's not in any order right now, is the 4 things we have to think about are systems, patients, staff, and family, right? Now, one of these is probably where you're most comfortable, which is systems, right? We need to think about how do we get our systems back up or protected. But we also need to be thinking about how do we assure that patient care is not impacted. So patients are critical. We have to make sure our staff, at least from a psychological perspective, is aware of how to respond and maintain focus on patient safety. So how incident response involves our staff, not just IT, but the broader organization, the entire organization, is critical to the success of incident response. And then ultimately what I call family and friends, which is how are we communicating with family and friends? If you've not been part of a real incident, as soon as word gets out that so-and-so hospital is on divert because they had a cyber incident, there's a few different people that are going to start to want answers. One is family. Imagine that you have a loved one in the hospital. First thing I'm asking is, should I move my family member out of that hospital or not? How safe is this place, right? And knowing what I know, guarantee you I'm getting a private ambulance and moving my family member. Second thing is, right, the patients themselves are going to want to know, should I stay in this hospital? Am I safe or not? And how we communicate that, the dialogue that ensues, is critical, both for the external person, the family member that's outside or the friend, and the patient themselves. And we have to incorporate all 4 of these elements into any go-forward modern day healthcare specific, patient-centric incident response plan. But how do we deal with prioritizing this? Well, the way you want to prioritize this is patients first. Right, the very first thing we need to think about when it comes to incident response, we've had a cybersecurity incident, ransomware attack is taken on, hit the hospital, systems are impacted. Number one thing we need to think about across all areas of the hospital, including IT, is what's going on with the patients. right? And there's a lot to this than just putting it up on a PowerPoint slide. Second thing is our staff, then family, and then lastly is systems. Now, I'll touch on this real briefly, but again, there's a lot more to learning this and figuring out how to do this correctly. The reason it's in this order is, first and foremost, frankly, patients are the number one thing we need to think about. The staff has to be supported on the ground in order to do great patient care. Family and friends have to be reassured, and none of the things matter if the systems aren't brought up in the right way. So when we think about things like RTO, RPO, order of recovery, none of that matters until we have the actual incident and we start understanding what's the impact on patients, right? We may think that the EMR is the first thing to bring up, but that's not really typically the first thing, because we don't know enough about what the situation is. And until we know what the situation is, we can't make decisions and we can't inform IT as to what systems you should be bringing up first. It really comes down to, in the moment, making the decision as to what systems come up first. And the reason for that is going to be what is going to be the best benefit of the patient. Now, this kind of translates to this cycle, right? We're going to prioritize patients, evaluate staff needs, address family concerns, audit what we know or don't know, and consider system status and objectives. And we're going to keep repeating that cycle. And that's going to become our protocol. That's what we're going to be doing minute by minute, hour by hour, until we get to a known state and we can kind of take a breather. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. Now, there's a liability window we've learned about. And this liability window is that the decisions and actions you take in that first 72 hours will be the most high liability decisions that you have to make. So when you're thinking about incident response and recovery, these are where making a bad decision or psychological and emotional impact, not acting from muscle memory, whatever it may be, is going to come and have the most dramatic impact on you. And the closer you are to this 0 hour, and 0 hour is when you discovered the attack, not when the attack started, right? The closer you are to that, the higher likelihood you will make bad decisions. Now, we'll talk more about this, but I want you to keep in mind that your incident response plans should be all about what do you do in that first 72 hours? And how do you do that from a muscle memory perspective? Now, ultimately, you're going to kind of test everything again as a deposition test. I don't have a lot of time to get into deposition tests, but basically you're going to get sued. So you might as well get planning for it and figuring out how you're going to address the lawyers 18 months after your incident. And what I will tell you is, earlier on I mentioned over here that this is the order of recovery. Now, why is that so important? Well, obviously it's A, the right thing to do, but B, from a legal perspective, you probably don't want to be in a situation where you get put in front of an attorney during a deposition and they ask you, so how did you bring back the systems, in what order? And you say, well, we brought them back according to our policy and procedures, which are laid out in our incident response and disaster recovery plans. Oh, that's great. And in the moment, did those systems take into account the acuity of the patients in your ICU, or did you just follow the plan? Well, we just followed the plan. Oh, so did your plan ever think about ICU patient acuity or the census in the emergency room, and that there may be a need to get other systems up and running much faster than what you thought about in this plan that you wrote 3 years ago? That's going to be a very bad and hard day for you. So the reason we do this and the reason we link system return to operations to patients is because we want to be able to position that if we ever get asked that question, again, aside from the fact that it's the right thing to do because patients should be first, is that we can say we brought systems back online in accordance with the clinical guidance received from our clinical teams who were attempting to take care of patients first and foremost. Much better answer, and you shut down any legal liability, hopefully. Okay, so moving beyond that, we kind of get back to this, and what we can see is we're able to map these different areas of responsibility, right? Within that first 90 minutes, we want to make sure that our patients are being managed well, that our clinicians have everything they need to hopefully get the patient to a known state. And again, these are conversations that have to happen with clinicians. We then need to transition from 90 minutes to about 8 hours on staff care. Is the staff morale right? Is the staff psychology correct? Is the staff engaged, right? We had a situation where we did a tabletop, a very large tabletop several months ago, and the executive leadership was like, we've got the greatest staff in the world. If this ever happened here, they would be totally on board. We then the next day did an actual tabletop with the staff on the ground, the nursing station nurses and nursing supervisors, shift leads, the actual people on the ground. And about an hour into our tabletop, one of the shift leads raised their hand and said, if this ever happened here, I can guarantee you we'd have people wanting to go home and nobody would be coming in to help relieve people. And that was an eye-opening moment for executive leadership because they had never considered the psychological impact of a cyber attack on staffing. And so this is why staff care is something we need to understand within the first 8 hours. Are they doing okay, and do we have the ability to keep going forward, right? Within that kind of mid 8 to 24 hours, we want to assure we have our family communication ready to go so we can reduce the noise and allow our teams to stay focused on patient care. And then from 24 to 72 hours, we're probably going to start thinking about prioritization and recovery of our systems. Probably not going to be able to do it, and I'll explain why in a few moments, but at least you hopefully have a priority that is focused and tied to patient acuity and patient needs, right? That is driven by your clinicians. The way we manage this is something we call things you know, things you don't know. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but basically it's just this is all we teach people to do, including our security operations center that we run, is when we have an incident, the only two things I want to know are what do we know, which means that these things have been validated and confirmed as known, and what don't we know that we need to know, right? And those are the kind of how we run our incident response journals. If you're using our product and our platform, we bake this into our platform itself. It's part of our incident response module. That's part of our CAS solution on our Nightingale platform. In terms of some other things you need to know is asset valuation and high value targets. I won't get too deep into this. I can answer it in the Q&A if you wish, but basically asset valuation is what are the most important assets in the environment. High value targets are what are things that are important to the attacker. And again, these are things that we have embedded in our platform. So we have this as part of our DNA, but you should be adopting it. If you're not using our platform, you should really think about it. So the idea here is to bring this cycle that we've talked about earlier, prioritizing patient, staff needs, family concerns, what we know, what we don't know, system status and objectives all together into one framework. And this is the backbone of our incident response. And you could take these slides in this recording and run with it on your own if you wish, but we found that when we bring this together and we approach incident response from this perspective, where we're really thinking about the patient, we vastly reduce liability, we vastly improve the chances of safe patient outcomes through this event, and we actually create a much better coordinated response that's not just IT trying to protect data, but ultimately an entire hospital system trying to respond to a cyber attack in a coordinated fashion. Now, I'm going to go back to something I said a lot earlier, which is violence and velocity dictate that there's probably only one or two things that you can do as an IT team. And what we've learned is when we put IT teams through tabletops, they ultimately do really well. And especially if they just do one of these two things. It doesn't matter what attack I throw at you. To have a playbook or an incident response plan that says, well, for a DDoS attack, we do this, and for a blah, blah, blah attack, we do that, and for whatever other attack, we do this. Doesn't really you don't get a lot of good return on investment, because the velocity attack dictates that there's one of two things you're going to do. You're either going to contain the attack, which you're either going to do that manually somehow, or you're going to have automated systems like our orchestrator product that are going to execute playbooks and help you shut down the pathway of the attack, right? So if I know I have a laptop that is creating the attack and I can shut those down or get them off the network, I've contained it. The reality of life is somewhere within the first 5 to 7 minutes, you're going to realize that either your containment is successful, right, if we're working off of this 14-minute response window, or that this attack is not being contained. And this is why hierarchical response plans where somebody's got to call somebody to get permission to do something don't work, because you got about 5 to 7 minutes to decide, are we going to keep trying to contain this thing, or are we moving into prevention? And prevention simply means we are going to shut down systems that have not been in fact impacted by this attack, right? And so we're going to take offline anything that hasn't become a victim of the attack in hopes of being able to prevent the spread of the attack and enhance our ability to recovery once we get things under control. And that's really it. So when we're looking at incident response plan in this day and age, we're really focusing on patient-centric response, but ultimately we're trying to figure out from an IT perspective, do you have all the tools and knowledge you need and processes to either contain or prevent, and simplify that down to one of two options. So that's kind of why we mentioned things earlier. As you guys may know or not know, we do have a security operations center. It's not really a SOC, it's more of a tactical operations center, started in 2016. And from the very beginning, we've done patient-centric response. And whenever we have a real serious incident, our team should be responding using everything we just talked about. And we use something called the rapid response protocol. I'm going to skip some of this, but ultimately this is kind of a high level of how we respond. And what I want you to kind of think about is this qualify box, right? And one of the key questions that we ask or we're trying to determine when we're responding to a situation is life at risk? I bring this up so if you're not working with our security operations center, we wish you would, but if you're not, one of the things you should be doing in terms of triaging inbound incidents and issues is determining what is the impact to human life, right? Because that is the backbone of a patient-centric incident response program. So things to consider. One, being patient-centric definitely is scary for most IT organizations. It is changing where we focus. We're getting into a world that now patient safety and outcomes is really on our shoulders. And that's not something a lot of IT organizations may be very comfortable with, but it is something that I think is going to become the requirement or the standard as we go forward. I think as we learn more about attacks and the outcomes of patients who have been involved in attacks and lawsuits continue to increase, it's going to be a very big issue. Recovery is based on the acuity of patients overall and dictated by the real-time circumstances, not the playbook or plan. Basically, what this means is it is challenging for IT organizations to not have a well thought out step A, step B, do this first, do that first plan when it comes to the order of recovery for systems, and to have one that is based on patient acuity and impact to patients and what we need to be doing for patients. It's a very different form of disaster recovery. And very few organizations, if any, other than one that I know of, that knows how to do this type of disaster recovery planning. Command centers do not work. This is something we've seen time and time again, where people will spin up a command center. I won't get into it, but for the most part, depending on the hospital size you have, the time of the event, who's in the command center, and how that all operates, command centers just get in the way. Whenever we've done tabletops where we're working with clinicians and other areas of the hospital, the command center, as soon as the command center spun up, we see everything come to a screeching halt. So you really need to rethink, like, what is the role of your command center? We recommend a blended model where the command center is really managed by the people on the ground and not executives, and then kind of have like a leadership command center or executive command center or whatever you want to call it that is dealing with all the operational, legal, communication stuff, and leave the real command center of how you keep patients safe to the people on the ground, because they do an amazing job when they're left alone. And I can tell you, every time we see the C-suite get involved, that command center comes to a screeching halt. And it's sad because they usually are doing a great job until that moment. If you're thinking of incident response, solve for the 3 a.m. This means, how does this plan hold up at 3 a.m. when nobody's around and you don't have all the resources you need, right? And this, again, like the command center, if something happens at 3 a.m., you're probably not going to have all the people that you would traditionally put in a command center. You still can spin up a command center, you just need to think a bit differently. This is going to be really important when we talk with FDA. Hopefully you guys will join that webinar next month, and we're going to talk about recovery and restoration. And there's a difference in that gap. So we talked about this 72-hour window where you need to be really thinking about how you're going to, prioritize your systems and patient care and all of that. Keep in mind, recovery is this concept of my systems are back up, but that does not mean that you can use the systems. Right? If I throw an attack at you that takes out all of your smart pumps, you can't just say, oh, let's reboot the smart pumps and put them back online and connect them to a patient. You have to clear everything. Even if I take out your EMR, you have to clear the EMR. You don't know if the attacker went in there and deleted everybody's allergies or changed their medical history or changed their drug dosing. So you have to think in terms of recovery being, we've recovered our systems and they're operational, but restoration and how we're going to restore them to an operational clearance is vastly different. And so when you think about outages in a cybersecurity incident, you sometimes are hearing like it's 6 to 8 weeks for an organization to get back. And the reason for that is often that the restoration process takes a very long time. And this is something that I think we don't speak about or capture enough. Old school communication really does work. Having old POTS lines is a lifesaver. If your hospital has the ability to bring back online the old POTS phones and touch tone phones, do yourself a favor, put them at every nurse's station, in the IT offices, in your purchasing offices, put 6 or 7 of them in purchasing and finance, and have a way to talk using the old touch tones. We've seen the VoIP stuff really compromises security. Purchasing is often going to be the number 1 or number 2 thing you have to restore. You've got to get the purchasing department up and running as fast as possible. Typically, we're learning that most hospitals only have 3 days of supplies. You've already learned that the first 72 hours are the most critical and challenging in terms of decision making. You now handcuff people that they can't get supplies, they can't get the equipment they need. Guess what? You've just created an additional psychological or emotional response. You will lose a lot more money in a cyber attack than you invest in preparing for it. So the more you invest, chances are you'll be better off not having to lose a ton of money from a revenue perspective. How do you gain program adoption? This is a big one, right? You've got to ultimately get your executive leadership to buy in. That's step 1, is getting them to understand that cybersecurity incident response and recovery is not an IT responsibility anymore. IT has about 10 to 15% of the overall response accountability. Everything else beyond that is everybody else in the hospital. And so if you're going to measure the effectiveness of cybersecurity incident response, it's going to have to be looked at well beyond what IT can bring to the table. So you've got to get your IT, your executive leaders to understand, hey, all these incident response plans and disaster recovery, not really my job, really up to you. Unless you don't really care about the patients, then we're good. So we could talk more about all these other components. There's a lot we do as CloudWave. We do have a patient-centric incident response capability to do assessment and planning and training. We do have our entire platform, CTOC and Security Operations Center, Tactical Operations Center, and our Nightingale system. We do offer the backup and recovery. We're now integrating those things together, so it's one seamless experience between our security infrastructure and our recovery and backup stuff. We are thinking about and working on having incident rapid response teams that you can call upon and help you through an incident for that first 72 hours. And obviously we do an amazing amount of tabletop simulations, and we keep trying to advance those all the time. I mentioned this various times. Next month on April 25th at 2 p.m., we're doing a conversation with FDA. The person that we're going to be working with there, Jessica Wilkerson, amazing. I've worked with her for years. She's being gracious enough to do this just for you guys. And so if you have questions that you want to have FDA answer during that session, please submit it to us. We'll get them over to FDA, and hopefully they'll be comfortable answering those in the forum. We will try to do some live Q&A, but really would love to get your questions so we can customize this presentation for your needs. So hopefully you'll be excited about that. We're going to build on the incident response stuff we just talked about. We're going to talk about some real world cyber incidents that FDA is aware of and have been declassified that they can share. So I think you'll have a really good, this is an event you should invite your C-suite to, right? If you need help getting them to understand the pressure you're under, the pressure everything I just talked about today puts you under, get them to come to this. Because I think they'll learn a ton, and they can ask anything they like, or you can on their behalf. So that's it. Hopefully this was helpful. It's a lot, and I know it creates a lot of anxiety, agita, and maybe for some of you, you're like, we're already doing all this. And if you are, I'd love to hear from you, because you are definitely that 1%, and I think a lot of others could learn. World's changing, right? We have to start thinking about how our incident response, our IT, everything we do impacts patients, and reverse engineer from there. So with that, Laura, I'm not sure if we have any questions or not. I know you're going to be putting out a survey and further details on FDA, but other than that, any questions or feedback or thoughts?
We don't have any questions at this time.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. I look forward to our next opportunity to speak. If you ever need anything from me, I'm Jay Gomez at gocloudwave.com. And thank you so much for taking the time today. Bye-bye.